Welcome to Chalk and Talk, a podcast about education and math. I'm Anna Stockey, a math professor and your host. Welcome back to another episode of Chalk and Talk. Today I'm joined by Tom Sherrington, an education consultant, author of Rosenshine's Principles in Action, co-author of the Teaching Walkthrough series, and a former teacher and school leader with over 30 years of education experience. When people ask me where to start with evidence-based teaching, the first thing I usually point them to is Barack Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. They're clear, practical, grounded in research, and they come up a lot on this podcast. Before we get into the conversation, I want to briefly spell out exactly what Rosenshine's principles are, in case you're not sure. Rosenshine identified 10 instructional principles drawn from research on effective teaching. And here they are. Number 1, begin a lesson with a short review of previous learning. 2, present new material in small steps with student practice after each step. 3, ask a large number of questions and check the responses of all students. 4, provide models of worked out problems. 5, guide student practice. 6, check for student understanding. 7, obtain a high success rate. 8, provide scaffolds for difficult tasks. 9, require and monitor independent practice. And 10, engage students in weekly and monthly review. In this episode, Tom and I talk about where these principles came from, why they matter, and what they actually look like in real classrooms, with particular attention to sequencing concepts and modeling, effective questioning, reviewing material, and the stages of practice. This conversation will be useful for educators at all levels who want concrete, evidence-informed guidance they can actually use in practice. I hope you find it helpful. Now, before we get started, I have an exciting announcement. I'll be co-delivering a 4-session online short course on evidence-based math teaching through Australia's La Trobe University School of Education starting in April 2026. The course is open to teachers anywhere in the world, and I will include a link in the show notes for registration. And I'll include a link in the show notes to Rosenshine's paper too. Now, on with the show. I am thrilled to be joined by Tom Sherrington today. He is an education consultant and author. He has 30 years of experience as a physics and math teacher, or maths teacher, and school leader. He writes the popular blog, teacherhead.com. His books include The Learning Rainforest and the bestseller Rosenshine's Principles in Action, which we're going to talk a lot about today. He also co-authored the Teaching Walkthrough series with Oliver Caviglioli, and he works with schools around the world to provide training and consultancy support on improving the quality of teaching through the walkthroughs materials. He co-hosts the podcast, Mind the Gap, which I had the pleasure of being on not too long ago. Welcome, Tom. Welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for welcoming. I'm really honored to be on your show.
Thank you. We're going to talk a lot about Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction today. Barack Rosenshine published a wonderful paper that we've talked about a lot on this podcast called Principles of Instruction, Research-Based Strategies That All Teachers Should Know. And you've actually written a book on Rosenshine's principles, so you're the expert here. Before we get into the principles themselves, who was Barack Rosenshine? What was his background?
So as far as I understand it, he started off being a history teacher in the 60s, which he did for a few years, but then he went into higher education and then he studied education as a phenomenon, really. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, he was a researcher working, I think he's from Chicago, but I could be wrong about that. He had a career as a researcher studying what teachers do in classrooms. And he came to prominence in the UK through this very condensed version of his work, which we'll talk about. But I know various people knew he had a higher profile before, but I don't think as well known as he could, as he deserves to be, probably. And he died a few years ago. So we can't really talk to him about it directly. He has left a legacy of papers and videos online. But that's essentially who he was. He was a teacher, and then he became a researcher. And then he gave someone who promoted these ideas about instructional teaching.
He was an American teacher who became a researcher, and he left a great legacy because I think when people ask me what's something that you can point me towards about evidence-based instruction, that's usually the first thing I'll say is Rosenshine's principles because they're so clear and they just make a lot of sense. My understanding is actually he had come up with 17 evidence-based instructional procedures and that those informed his 10 principles. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that was an evolution from earlier works. One of my favorite things is I wrote that booklet about Rosenshine's principles. People send me stuff. And one of my favorite things is a paper he wrote in 1986, which is called Instructional Functions. And that's got 6 things. And over time, he kind of added a few. And then by the time we get to 2010, when he wrote the paper, which is the one we know, he sort of was forced to summarize it. There's a journal called the International Academy of Education Journal. It's very weird, long, thin booklets. And he published the principles in there. But he was asked to do them as 10. And so he sort of morphs the 17 into 10. And then that was republished in the American Educator magazine in spring 2012, which is an incredible issue because it's got other things in there by Kirshner, Sweller and Clark and Dan Linigan and various people. So it's like an epic issue. And that was the thing that got popularized in the UK, those 10 principles. I don't know how he felt about it, but some people prefer the 17 because they're more precise. But it's a lot of things to remember and go through, so it gets a bit overwhelming.
I think 10 is a good number. The 17, there's a bit more detail, right?
Yeah, they're very specific things. They're literally as precise as, begin a lesson with a review of prior learning or something. And you think, okay, sounds sensible. But I always say to people that even though they seem sensible on the surface, there's a lot in them. One of them is provide many examples. And you think, okay, so which examples, how of which type? There's so much to unpack in every single one of them. And even things like check the responses of all students and that little cheeky all in there. He doesn't say check the responses of a few students. He says of all students. And you think, well, okay, so even though they seem kind of common sense at a surface level, each one of them it takes a lot of thought to think, okay, well, how do I actually do that properly? I think it's a very rich source because everything in there is not as obvious as it seems. And so teachers have to think quite hard about doing them well.
So they're research-based. Did he conduct that research himself, or did he come up with them based on research done by other scholars?
He says in the paper that is popularized, it's a little bit obscure, to be honest, but you have to know that he did research. One reading of it is that I always imagine he hadn't known it himself because he's quite he reports it in the third person. And it's like research was done or has been done. He's not saying we did this, but when you know about his research, he says there are 3 types of research. One of them is cognitive science studies. So when he's citing various people who have done studies into memory and learning. So that's not his research. He's also talking about some intervention studies, things like reading studies, experiments with types of scaffolds. That's another type of research. And then the third type, which is he's contributed to, but he also cites others, is observational, watching teachers who get good outcomes and comparing them with teachers who get worse outcomes and codifying kind of what they do and what the differences are. And he cites various other people who have contributed to that research. And it's an interesting debate to have because some people, I don't know why, but I suppose that Some people contest the idea that Rosenshine's principles are, very strictly speaking, evidence-informed, in the sense that each one of the principles has been subjected to a specific study. It's a bit more subtle than that. It's like a combination of sources coming together, and then he's proposing them as mainly features of practice that teachers demonstrate when they're getting good outcomes, which also are supported by the evidence from cognitive science. And he says very clearly there's no conflict between those things. So we should have confidence. And I always say that in my training sessions, that imagine if cognitive scientists were saying the research about memory and learning suggests teachers should do these things. But weirdly, when we go into classes where the outcomes are good, they're doing totally different things. That would be confounding, but that isn't what happens. And Rosenshine makes a big point of saying there's no conflict between them. So when you observe teachers getting good outcomes, the things they do are supported by the evidence from cognitive science. And I think that's the spirit in which he says the evidence informed. He does cite various studies and for each of them. But I do think there is a kind of interpretation and assimilation of ideas packed in there.
It's kind of like there's three things coming together. There's cognitive science research, there's experimental research, and there's observational research, and they all kind of land on the same things. Like, for instance, practice. Nobody should really be disputing that practice is important, is basically verified by those three types of research.
What I like about that is that practice sounds obvious, but he puts quite a lot of parameters around that. The nature of the practice, high success rate, practicing success, and only moving from guided practice to independent practice when this has been a success rate. So, yeah, no one should contest it, but it's not as obvious as just, oh yeah, go to practice. It's like, what exactly are you practicing? He's very precise about that. And I think that's important to always say those things, that it's the precision of it, which I think makes them useful.
I agree with you. And that's one of the things I definitely want to talk about today is practice and the type of practice and how you know when someone's had enough practice and that sort of thing. We're going to come to that right away. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned that in the UK, people use Rosenshine's principles or they know of Rosenshine's principles. Would you say that most teachers in the UK know about Rosenshine's principles now?
I don't know if it's most. I think if you had to sort of score the things which are most known, Rosenshine's principle would be one of the highest. But that doesn't mean, like in any group of teachers, say more than half of the teachers will know even if they've heard of the name because it gets bandied around, they won't really know what it is. Because a lot of teachers are very subject focused. And so their kind of reference points are all about subject, curriculum. And so something generic called like Rosenshine isn't something they ever encounter or really think about. In some schools, I go there to do training and I'm kind of expecting a bit of a kind of, yeah, we know. And actually, they don't. Like, how many of you have read Rosenshine's principles? No one. Oh, wow, okay, no one's read it. Okay, interesting. Because you're sort of thinking, where have you been? But then the reason the where have they been is not on Twitter or something. It's quite common for teachers, not in a whole group of people, not to have given it any attention whatsoever. But I don't think there are any things more well-known than Rosenshine, put it that way. That shows you kind of how any one particular reference is never that well-known. Even something like Teach Like a Champion, Dudlamov. Most teachers, I would say, have heard of growth mindset, but have never read Carol Dweck directly or the debate around it. You just know about that it's a thing, but they've heard of. You know what I mean? It's quite hard to gauge. And even if I ask someone, so if I tested anyone, I know I don't actually do this, but you sort of sense that the detail behind the label, Rosenshine's principles, isn't that well known.
Do you work with teachers in the US and Canada sometimes?
I have. I mean, I've only just a small degree. So yeah, I've been to research ed in Canada and the US, and I did some work near Winnipeg, Manitoba earlier this year, which was fantastic.
I'm just curious if you've noticed that maybe the UK has been moving forward a lot more quickly with these types of evidence-based instructional principles.
Oh, yeah, I think so, for sure. And Australia is quite fast moving as well, I would say. And to the point there where in the UK, there's a move which is you're pushing against an open door. So people want to know and they're asking for more. And we're not trying to fight the battle of why we should be talking about cognitive science and the kind of, we're not having to sort of talk endlessly about inquiry-based learning. People understand that memory and retrieval practice and various other things are important ideas. And I think we've come a long way. Whereas in the US, you still have, some debates which I've been involved in at certain events, which I haven't had in the UK for a long, long time, where people sort of even contest the idea of whether or not children should know facts and stuff, and think, wow, okay, we're really at that point. So it is interesting the journey different places are on.
We've got to start moving more towards that evidence-based instruction soon. That's my hope. But absolutely, you will definitely hear that in Canada. There will be people who say learning facts doesn't matter. You can just Google it. That's still happening here. And I would guess that not many people have heard of Rosenshine's principles here.
It really is interesting that, it's always something that's slightly confounding that most of the people that we refer to in UK, Dan Winningham, people like Doug Lemov, whether it's Rosenshine, all sorts of people, Fiorella and May, Art Shimamura, and these sorts of people who have been very influential, I think, are from the US or North America generally, and they're not. And E.D. Hirsch, like people who've been celebrated for breaking through in ideas about knowing things and the research, and even like movements like Deans for Impact and these sort of places where talking about how teachers learn, big influence, but they probably are at scale less influential in the US than they are in the UK. So it's because we're more condensed, we're more homogenous in our system. So the ideas get disseminated more intensively, I suppose.
Oh, you think that's what it is?
I think there's a lot to do with it. I think the explosion of social media in a sort of 2012, 13, 14, which connected practitioners to policymakers to researchers in one space with the same curriculum, the same national system. I think that was very powerful as a way of mobilizing information about learning. And in the US, that's just nowhere close to being that dynamic because it's just so big.
We should talk about Rosenshine's principles. And I like the way you do this in the book. And I do recommend for people listening that you get the book because it's a nice read. It's a quick read. I think it'd be really helpful, for helping your teaching. You actually condense the 10 procedures into 4 strands. So you have sequencing, concepts, and modeling. And then you have questioning, and then reviewing material, and then stages of practice. So I thought we'd go through some of those strands. We'll see what we can get through. I just would like to talk about practice. We've talked a lot about things like modeling and explicit instruction, the actual how you break things down, that sort of thing. We might come back to that, but let's start with stages of practice. So we have 3 principles that you put in that category. Principle 5, guide student practice. Principle 7, obtain a high success rate. And Principle 9, independent practice. Rosenshine states that the best way to become an expert is through practice, thousands of hours of practice. And the more the practice, the better the performance. And I would completely agree with that. So what else does he say about practice?
Well, he basically says this thing all the way through his principles, which is, he just says more effective teachers typically do this compared to less effective teachers. This isn't a kind of magazine style write-up. He's not presenting data at that point, but he's making the case. And he says more successful teachers spend more time guiding students' practice of new material. done less effective. And guiding the practice is key, because he has a very big thing about success rate. And to get a success rate around 80%, he cites a study. And to be honest with you, this is one of the things in the principles I'm slightly skeptical about, the actual numbers. So he cites a study where, for example, a fourth grade maths class, it was found that 82% of students' answers were correct in the most successful teachers, but the least successful teachers had a success rate of only 73%. I thought 82 to 73, that feels like margin of error in the measurement. It feels a bit too neat to me. It's not that different. But basically the point is, he's saying high success rate is a factor of classrooms where the outcomes end up being high. And you might think that sounds like a sort of self-fulfilling thing, but it's actually to do with the construction of the lesson. And the more you're practicing getting things wrong, the more habits you're forming around bad methods in maths, for example, or inappropriate language or incorrect language in English or whatever. It's a concept of high success rate which bridges between guided practice and independent practice. And in order to get the success rate high, which has many benefits, it builds confidence, but it also has challenge. So it's not 95%. He says there has to be challenge. You have to be pushing towards something slightly ahead of you. And that links with the small steps idea. So what I like about the principles, they intersect. So guided practice around small steps. We don't guide practice by saying, like, here's 5 steps you need to go do, and then saying, here's a step. Let's see if you can do that. Okay, here's the next step. Let's all make sure you can do that. So you guide, you interact with the class all the time. Instruct, check for understanding, guide some practice, instruct some more, check for understanding, guide some practice. It's very incremental, step by step, small steps. And you vary the steps according to the success rate, according to the confidence or background knowledge of the students. And the more sophisticated the students are, the more you can get them to practice at once. And you have to adapt. And your guiding thing is the success rate. So if the success rate is low, well, you may be getting them to practice too much at once. So you break it down to smaller steps, maybe instruct a bit more to get the success rate up again. And success rate, to me, in this context, is a nominal idea. It's very hard to measure in any meaningful sense. It means most of them are getting most of it right most of the time. And you're looking for that to be as high as you can make it. And I think that's essentially the spirit of it. But he then goes on to say more. He says, one of the key things to have in mind is the independent practice to come, that you're not going to let them do things on their own, which you haven't guided them to succeed in the first place. I was talking about this with my wife recently, who's a deputy principal of a secondary school. And this weird phenomenon of the teacher going through the sort of easy ones and says, right, now do you try these hard ones? But you haven't modeled the hard questions, which you've now given them to do as the extension from your simple guided. You've got to model the harder questions, get them to be successful at the harder questions with guidance, and now say, right, now try some of these harder questions by yourself, because you've shown you can do it with some help. Now see if you can do it without the help. And that's why I think Rosenshine is genius. It's not that it's well established in people's thinking. A lot of teachers think, oh, well, it's better if they've done it by themselves and struggled it out. And he's saying, no, it isn't. It's better if you've guided them to be successful. And now see if they can be successful independently, doing the same thing. That's the key part of this whole thing about practice. And he says it explicitly, where students are practicing things independently, which they have not previously succeeded at with guidance, the outcomes are worse. It's about building fluency and confidence with things you've already succeeded at. And I think it's not like earth-shattering, but it's quite significantly different to what some teachers actually do in their lessons.
Let's just talk a little bit more about the 80% success rate, because that could mean a lot of things. Do we mean that you can move the individual student on to independent practice when the individual student is generally getting things right 80% of the time? Is that what that means?
I've been asked this many ways, and I think you have read the section over and over to like, am I sure I'm interpreting this correctly? It definitely does not mean 80% of the students succeed. I've been asked that. If 20% of them aren't quite getting it, do you move on anyway? No. All of the students need to be getting 80% success rate. And so some of them might arrive at that point sooner than others. And that's just a reality. And so you have to be ready for lessons to support students to move to independent practice when they're ready. And that means you have to have things like tiering in question types or structured tasks in other subjects where you need to be able to do this. This is what I'm focusing on as you're learning. But when you've done this, move to that. So the guided practice, the independent practice phase can form a natural extension. But yeah, so that's what it means. That's what I took to mean. So every student needs to be getting that 80% success rate, which means a lot of them need a lot more help than others to get to it. But that's the goal. And obviously, the more homogenous your class is in terms of their alignment with learning rate, and the more you sort of keep them together, the better. So, which is like a mastery approach is helpful because you're keeping people with you and you can move together. But there are times, obviously, where, and you see that subtle forms of different levels of guidance, independent work in subjects beyond maths. In maths, I think it's kind of one of the easier ones to do because you've got it, as long as you understand curriculum design and can sequence questions in a ladder of difficulty that's sensible. I see sometimes maths problem sets which are just really poor. You've got 3 easy ones, 3 middle ones, and 3 hard ones. Kind of everyone's doing all of them. And it's so obvious that some students need like 10, 15, 20 easy ones to get that more fluent. And then other students are really ready to fight right to the end and do the hard questions in the same room. And that is where they're at. They're all algebra, they're all whatever. You have to practice at the point where it's going to make the biggest impact on you. And that's the success rate is in that now. That's why you end up having sets, ability grouping in England quite commonly, because you can no longer sustain a practice regime that's manageable practically. And that's what happens, because if you've got divergence and a bit in success rate that's too big. But I think that's the point of it. He actually says one of the issues with high success rate is about misconceptions. I quite like the section. I'll just read it to you. It says, when we learn a new material, we construct a gist of this material in long-term memory. However, many students make errors in the process of constructing this mental summary. And these errors can occur when the information is new and the student did not have enough background knowledge. These constructions were not errors so much as attempts to be logical. So they're trying to make sense of things. And so they form a kind of a way of working with the material. And that can get stuck. The danger is not just when you're practicing material without enough sort of secured knowledge. It's not that you're just getting wrong and being demotivated. It's actually you're forming sort of intellectual coping mechanisms or schema for the material, which are wrong. So you're not learning cheats and stuff, which only work for certain examples, and then they become unstuck. That type of thing, So you don't want that. You want to practice doing the long method and doing it fully and properly so they fully understand it, rather than thinking they can cut corners because it seems to work. Providing guided practice after teaching small amounts of checking can help limit the development. That breaking down of short feedback loops, that's the language I would use, is short feedback loops. Explain, check, practice. Do one like I've just done. Check it's right. What did we get? Does everyone understand it? Here's another one. Try this one. And okay, it's really to and fro, And rather than less effective teachers typically go like, explain. Right, off you go. Practice.
Yeah, you want to be checking for understanding all the time.
And from all students as well. This is what I love about it. It's subtle, but it's absolutely in there. In Rosenshine, is all. You have to have this radar, this sense for where the success is. I was talking to teachers today in a school, which is a very successful school. Recently, some great accolade. Literally, ranked in the newspaper as being the best school in England, which is kind of unbelievable, really, but it's based on various things. But the teaching was very good. But their issue is, who are the 5 students in your class who are the lowest achievers? Do you even know who they are? Are you looking to see how successful they're being? Because you've got all this wave of positive success coming at you constantly. It's quite easy for those 5 to be sort of drowned out. And that's what they were saying literally is their issue. Because that radar for, I need to keep an eye on Jason because he finds this difficult and I'm going to check his success rate. It's much more individual, and teachers need to be looking and checking, which is hard, but necessary.
And so that comes under the questioning category, what you call the questioning category. There's principle 3, which is ask questions, and principle 6, which is check for student understanding. So how frequently should you be asking questions, and what does good questioning look like?
How frequently is a hard thing to quantify, but basically he cites a study in the paper about a maths class, and he gives one example where he says there's a particular maths lesson where typically they were spending 25 minutes out of a 40-minute session checking for understanding and questioning, versus a teacher in the same place doing 10 minutes. And the 25 minutes out of 40 was much more successful because a teacher, and this is an important part about this, the purpose of the questioning, which intersects with the guided practice, because they're not like separate whole phases, they're interspersed. The questioning serves 2 functions. One of them is for the students to have a chance to think and elaborate. So in formulating answers, if the culture is such that anyone should answer any of the questions, they all have to process the information mentally and start making models and so on. So it benefits them elaborating the idea, but also it reveals to the teacher where the errors are and which bits to reteach and what bits of understanding are. So, and that's important to have that double sense. Now, I've come across teachers where one or other of those isn't fully present in their thinking. So, for example, did you make all the students think of the answer? And sometimes, no, the routine is to select a student and ask them, select another student and ask them. Of course, now in the UK, I don't know how popular these are in Canada, but in the UK, show me boards, whiteboards are very popular, almost universal in most schools at some point. The point of them is it makes all the students produce answers and also shows them to the teacher. So sometimes if it's done poorly, some students' thinking isn't stimulated because they're not expected to answer every question. But also quite commonly teachers that just sort of take the answers and look at them and don't really use it literally responsively. So now I saw a brilliant lesson today where the maths teacher was checking understanding about some indices, laws of indices, and then saying, okay, a lot of you got that one wrong. So here's another one like it. We're going to come to this one. So he just wrote it on the board. And then he said, but let's go through really step by step the laws of indices. And he was super precise. He was making them say things like 10 subtract -3. And it's like, there was no minus of a minus equals a plus. No way. It's like, we subtract -3. And so we add +3, that type of thing. Brilliant. It was like, they're all practicing that, all practiced it, show me boards, and then high success rate. And he said, okay, now we've got that one, now do this one. And it was like, there's another one to do. The whole point is, I think we're better now. So now see if you can have a go at this one. So there's all that thing of questioning, checking for understanding, linked immediately to a practice opportunity, responding to the fact that previously quite a number of them had got it wrong. So he's seeing error, reteaching, rehearsing again, and then practice again. It's like, that's how it's done. And actually, literally, a teacher who is very hot on Rosenshine's principles says, it was like, that's informed his practice. And you could see it, very evident. I think that's the key thing, that when you're asking a question, part of you is thinking, okay, I'll ask this question. And if they're not sure or a number of them are wrong, we'll do this. And it's just totally ready. You know that's what's going to happen rather than go, oh no, some of you are wrong. What do I do next? Some teachers feel like that's what's happened to them. They're not ready for the reteach. All they're prepared for is moving on. We do this, we get them right. We do these, we get them right. But if the students are not getting it right, where are my examples? Where are my resources? They're not totally tooled up in the moment to deal with, and sometimes we say, oh gosh, I have to come back to that later, because they're not sort of anticipating the very real the likelihood of significant error, and it captures them out. That's the role of checking for understanding. It's supposed to be loops of, okay, that's telling me how well you're doing. Let me now do this.
And what you're describing is also guided practice, right?
I think it is. I mean, guided practice has two forms. One of them is circulating. A friend and colleague of mine, John Tomset, who's written this lovely book about excellent teachers, which is essentially anecdotal, sort of like, well, it's like a type of study which is very expressive, interviews with the teacher, interviews with the students that they teach, observing them and so on. And there's a great maths teacher in this book called Chris McGrain, who's a Scottish maths teacher. And he describes what he calls teaching between the desks. He stands between the desks, like, because he's just supervising constantly. He doesn't stand at the front and hope everyone's doing okay. He's in amongst, checking. He says he feels he knows how everyone's doing because he's watching it happen, and he's very dynamic in that regard. And so I feel like that type of guided practice, literally supervising and checking as you go around, is one very powerful thing. And the other type is students doing questions and then self-assessing, and then we're talking about which ones did we get right or wrong. Or more question by question, interacting and finding out. That's in maths, obviously. But I feel like guided practice generally is interactive. That's not the off you go, get on with it type movement. That's the independent practice. Guided practice is interactive. It's sort of important to get that right, I think.
He called it standing between the desks. Is that what he called it?
Teaching between the desks.
Teaching between the desks. I call that quality control. When I have weekly labs with my students, I always say, okay, I'm going to do quality control now. And I go through and check everybody's work to make sure it's of high quality.
Sometimes, and it's funny how different things are expressed. So this paper called, anyone listening can search it, Instructional Functions. There's this beautiful text. It's kind of typed. It's fabulous. It's like a photocopy of a typed document that Rosenshine wrote as a prep for a talk, 1986. And he has at that point, step 3, initial student practice. He describes it in this way: high frequency of questions and overt student practice from the teacher and the materials. Prompts are provided during initial learning. All students have a chance to respond and receive feedback. The teacher checks for understanding by evaluating student responses. Continue practice and students affirm. Success rate of 80% or higher. And then later, in independent practice, so that students are firm and automatic. And he calls this seat work. This is when you're just getting on with, like, you're banging out loads of algebra problems or whatever. Looking for overlearning and automaticity. So it's nothing new. Now you're ready for the hard stuff. The independent practice is of the stuff you've already done. Getting a 95% or higher, he says. So I feel like that's an important idea, that sometimes when teachers think everything's always harder, it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it needs to be like consolidatory and repetitive, so you have this overlearning and fluency building. And sometimes I think we get that wrong. Like we set them off to go into sort of bad practice because they don't know how to do the things they're practicing.
Yeah, I think it's often the number one thing we get wrong in math. Students are given stuff to do that they haven't been taught how to do. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is they just don't get enough practice. And it's so important. Sometimes it's repetitive, and it has to be. Like, that is literally how you get good at math.
Yes. And this isn't from Rosenshine directly, but it's true of any subject, that you start mixing up the mode of presentation and trying to see if you can apply the same learning to other problems, synoptic problems, and where you can identify the problem type rather than being told the problem type. Recognizing you need to use Pythagoras rather than trigonometry to find the length of a side or whatever. But that comes from practicing all the other things first. So you can't suddenly be deep-ended into being confident with those things. But, this is slightly off the Rosenshine, but one of my bits of insight that I've gained over the years is from a fantastic maths person called Mark McCourt. He has this fantastic insight about how learning, we're talking about maths, but sometimes I feel like math is just a good metaphor for all the other subjects. That when you're climbing up a mountain, the higher you go and you look back down, you make sense of the journey you've been on so far more clearly than when you were on it at the time. So you might be in a bit of a gully and thinking, why are we here? Where are we going? What's all this for? And you see from above, you go, oh, I get it. That's where we were. Now it will make sense. And sometimes you have to support students through that period of uncertainty, trusting the fact that in your sense of the way the curriculum progresses, so they'll reach a point where it'll all land. It'll all make much more sense later, but not just yet. And I think the tolerance of some ambiguity around nailing total understanding, it can sometimes be a false promise. They're not going to fully understand it yet. Later, you'll see how things like Pythagoras and trig overlap and work together and are kind of the same thing, more or less. But to begin with, they're just topics which you teach discretely, and then later they'll link up, and then you can link it to. And that's true of history, literature, science, everything.
Yeah. You often don't see the big picture or get the understanding piece until later. When you're good at something, you can put all the pieces together and you know how things work, then it becomes easier to understand it. We should talk about review. So reviewing material is another one. That's another one of the categories. So principle 1 is daily review. And then principle 10 is weekly and monthly review. So it's like a full circle. It makes sense that principle 1 would be daily review, right?
It does, although it's interesting because when I organize this into my 4 strands, the reason I was doing it is because I was just reading the paper as the PDF. It was just being tossed around all over the internet, fantastic free PDF to carry a copy around with me in my bag everywhere. And I was doing a talk on it, actually at Research Ed. And I was thinking, I was sort of getting my thoughts together. I wrote this blog and I just thought, well, 10 things is just way too many. If you've got 40 minutes, it's just. And I realized I was kept on jumping. Daily review is the number 1 and weekly and monthly review is number 10. I was thinking, well, to me, you have to talk them at the same time. But I just thought, actually, it's a weird place to start because if you're preparing to teach, the second step, present new material in small steps, is where you really begin. And then models and scaffolds. Which models? So I felt like the stuff you can prepare before you go into the classroom are the small steps. You're thinking about how do I explain this and how big are the steps are in relation to where my students are. And I think that's really fascinating work to do with teachers. I've done this a fair bit now, is get them to break down explaining something into steps. And sometimes teachers don't realize how much their knowledge as the expert has masked their need to break it down. They think, gosh, that they might not know that, so I have to explain that and explain that. And they're using words which you think, gosh, that's another word I've used, which I have to explain. And I think, yes, well, you know all of that, but they don't know all of that. You can't just start talking about, acute and obtuse angles or something all of a sudden. Well, what are those? And, gosh, and how should we teach that? And when do we begin? And I can understand in terms of a lesson, let's start with daily review. But in terms of thinking about a whole unit of learning, presenting material in small steps is where I started. And then the model, what do I teach them? Which examples do I introduce? And then lots of subjects, that's really important, isn't it? Where do I start? Which examples do I give to make this abstract idea concrete and sequential and build a schema based on what they know? So it's so subtle. But you then have to flex it a bit. And Rosenshine says that, more effective teachers are better at identifying the steps being small enough and getting the students to practice after each one. Yeah, so that's where I'd start. The review only comes in then. And this is a fascinating piece of work that's just been circulated by Carl Hendrick in this area, which is around where review works and where it doesn't. And where it works is where the students have already been successful and they're literally reminding themselves of that success. Where review does not work is where they weren't successful in the lesson before, and now you're doing a quick recap quiz, which they can't do because they didn't do it before. So you have to go back to the success rate. If the success rate is high, then the review is a consolidation of that success. If the success rate is low, the review is confounding, and sometimes there are just way too many questions in a daily review. But obviously you've got to avoid the illusion of short-term task completion. All of you managed to do this. This used to blow my mind. I should teach maths, for example, and I would get 100% success rate of students 2 to the power of 4. 2 multiplied by 2, multiplied by 2, multiplied by 2. That's 16. Yeah. We're all getting 2 to the power of 4. Next day, 2 to the power of 4. You've got all these 8s appearing. So you realize, even sometimes the success rate can be only because of recency. You've just taught them it. It's buzzing in their sort of working memory pretty much, but they haven't really stored it. And so the review can sometimes burst your bubble of what Mark McCourt calls recency. I don't know if he coins the words, but he talks about recency being a major factor in maths. Like you have to reduce that. So testing later in a lesson or reviewing tomorrow to see if yesterday's learning has stuck. That's very true in languages as well. Like, well, you've got lots of small knowledge items. Are they still with you tomorrow? Do we go back? We go back. So review has that factor, which you've got to sort of make it part of the normal learning flow that we touch back with where we were. So it's so important to do that.
That happens to me all the time. You teach something and they get it and you're sure that you're done. Like they all get it. And then the next day it's like you didn't teach it. I think that is a really important reason to review. And then also just when you're teaching math, because math, as I always say, is very cumulative. So if you're teaching something new, it's probably going to rely on something that they learned before. And so it's good to review those things before you start that particular lesson, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, and I think sometimes in the way these become sort of routinized, if I can use that phrase, in English schools certainly, is that there's too much of a disconnect, in my opinion, between the review and the lesson. Sometimes it's very common to see the review being of other topics than the one we're about to follow. And I think preparing for today's lesson, like activating prior knowledge for the learning that's about to come. And weekly and monthly review is supposed to be more of that kind of checking back in. And Rosenshine does make that distinction. So daily review is more driven to, I like that phrase, activating prior knowledge. And it's as simple as saying, like, we did all these yesterday, guys. Here's another one. Just warm yourselves up. Should be straightforward. And often that works nicely. You just go, brilliant, nice and familiar. We did it yesterday. Do it again. And we're ready to build. But if that's unsuccessful, then of course you've got to deal with that at the time.
We talked about 3 of the 4 categories. And then the last one, which is actually your first one, because you said the thing that you always start with is present new material in small steps with student practice after each step. And I think your reason for that is because if you're the one designing the lesson, you want to think about how you break that topic, that concept down into steps and what steps are involved, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's something which in my Rosenshine's booklet, the Principles booklet, I use as an example is, and I do try to use many other examples, but there's a particular maths example in it, which I sort of tell the story of a student I encountered in a college. In England, a college would mean something sort of 16 to 18, but retaking the compulsory maths exam. So the GCSE in maths, is graded 1 to 9. And unless you get a grade 4, you have to take it again. So if you've got a grade 1, 2, or 3, you have to take it again. So you've got all these classes of students in colleges where they have to be taking maths, having failed it before. And these students are 16. And this boy who was doing fractions, and he'd written, the question was a quarter plus 2/3, and he'd written 3/7. So when I was saying to him, yeah, I can see what you've done there, but I will tell you straight away, I know that's wrong, because 3/7 is smaller than 2/3. And so I know it's wrong. So let's explore like why it's wrong and what you're doing. And then I was asking him, what's a quarter? Like in a chocolate bar or something. And he was saying, what do you mean? And I said, well, it says 1/4. What does that mean? And he just, what do you mean? And it's like, oh, well, okay. When he sees 1/4 visually, he doesn't understand that to mean like 25% or a quarter as a sum. He's literally not seeing that as representing a quarter. It's like, wow. So that whole time you've been in school, when it's like 2/3, he's not conceptually going, ping, 2/3, I get a feel of how big that is. Doesn't have that schema. He doesn't have that knowledge. He's just procedurally manipulating numbers and this weird line between them. And that's just mind-blowing. You think, how can you miss that? But he had. Loads of reasons why, and he really struggled with it. So I had to go back to saying, and I talked to the teacher about it, and he's saying, this is the trouble with this. Sometimes that's just fractions is conceptually, a lot of them find it hard. If it was decimals and percentages, they're much better for some reason because of money and things. So getting into understand, all the multiples of quarters and 2/8 being the same as a quarter, all of that was weak as anything. So, there's no point adding a quarter and 2/3, trying to work out lowest common multiple of 4 and 3 and everything, until we've really solidified our understanding of the meaning of it. And so just because he's 16 doesn't mean that's where he's at. So you have to teach that to him, because you can't just say, well, you should know this. I know, but I don't. That is what it takes. So in order to teach that well, you have to deconstruct it. You have to sort of work backwards and say, what are our basic assumptions, and check them. The size of fractions, the meaning of the denominator and the numerator in what they are. And then the classic one with fractions is something like, you multiply the denominators together, so 4 multiplied by 3 is 12. So it's a bad example to start with, because it works if you do multiply them. What you're actually doing is finding the lowest common multiple. So you have to work with ones where, like halves and quarters, where the lowest common multiple is 4, not 8. That type of thing. So you have to choose your examples so that you confound the shortcutting and build the whole thing about variation theory and where you start. So all of that, I think that's really important, because that informs everything else in Rosenshine's principles. It's very curriculum-centric. It's about knowing, and I would then exemplify that with other examples in a training day about how do you communicate the World War II, or how do you communicate solids, liquids, and gases, how do you communicate volcanoes and earthquakes and plate tectonics? What do we know? Like, where do we start? What's next? How does it build? Unless you have a sense of that trajectory as a teacher and what the next steps are, it just becomes stuff, and the students don't form schema coherently. And if you don't know it as a teacher, you can't really deal with the questions and anticipate misconceptions. So I think that's, for me, where I love Rosenshine, because it totally knits together with curriculum analysis. Although it's quite generic, it makes you think about your curriculum very strongly so that you can do all the other principles.
Principle 4 is provide models. So that includes modeling the steps, thinking aloud, and worked examples. We could talk about that if you want, or I've talked about it a fair bit on the podcast.
I think there's a subtle difference in language here. I think I've sort of, to be honest, taken some license with this, which is because I'm very keen for all teachers to find resonance when they do training, and often they do training together. So modeling is showing students what to do. It's the act of demonstrating. Whereas provide models can sometimes mean sort of exemplars of a different, like in art, for example. There's a slight difference, like in writing. Like you might say, here's an exemplar of a piece of writing, and here's another one, which is slightly different. And can we see the comparison between them? That writing is more effective than that, isn't it? Let's explain why. But you're not modeling in the sense of producing the writing. And I feel like you need to allow both of those to be part of the thinking. And that also then links to the scaffolding, because I think modeling and scaffolding sometimes hard to separate. So to some extent, modeling is a form of scaffolding. You're helping students access ideas through supported thinking, which later they have to do without. But in a way, when you're thinking about your modeling on what I'm going to show and what I'm going to tell and how am I going to demonstrate it, which examples, you're also thinking what scaffolds might help to sort of pin this to, like little rules, little heuristics, opening phrases, or more concrete scaffolds like sentence openers or half-completed problems, that type of thing. So your modeling performance, if you like, your explanatory input is connected to the scaffolds you're then going to leave the students with afterwards. And so you have to kind of have to design them in tandem.
Okay, because that's the last one. Principle 8, provide scaffolds for difficult tasks.
This is interesting, actually, because another bit of Carl Hendrik bombshell reveal. The idea of scaffolding to me has always been just well established as a sort of general idea in teaching. But evidently it was first brought to our attention by some specific people who did some experiments with like bricks, building blocks and stuff. And it turns out the study has been not replicated in a recent, much bigger study. So Carl Hendrik was saying, this is a bit of a bombshell. The origin of the concept of scaffolding was based on a very bad study. I didn't know about that study though. So the fact that it happened or not happened is almost like my world isn't shattered. But it is interesting about the detail of that. But I think the idea of scaffolding has transcended its origin, in my opinion, and it's become a kind of idea that you're supporting people to piece ideas together. It's a bit like a catalyst or something, like enzyme catalyst. You have molecules, things come together with a place to sit together on, and then that thing disappears and they're joined. It's like that's what you're doing with scaffolding. You're providing a way for ideas to coalesce for a student, and then that thing can disappear and they're stuck. So anything which helps students to form ideas, which they then no longer need after, is a scaffold. It's quite a broad idea. And in maths, one of the most obvious ones is what Rosenshine calls worked out examples. And this always makes me laugh because in England, some of those things which doesn't translate, everyone talks about worked examples, but he calls them worked out examples as a form of scaffolding, so that you actually show students what it looks like to be successful, and then they might do partial completion and that type of thing. And also narrating your thinking. So I like this because it links to the idea of a metacognition, which is another sort of big ticket labeled thing which people talk about, bandied around without knowing what it means. And Rosenshine just doesn't even go there. He just says, thinking aloud by the teacher. I just think, yes, that's what we mean. We mean, why did I do this? What step should I take next? What am I told in the question? What do I know over here? What equations can I use? Right, so let's see what would work first. Trial and error or logical system, whatever it is, like then narrating their thinking process to model that. And that type of cognitive apprenticeship idea is really important, that we're modeling to students how we as an expert think, so they try to emulate our thinking. And that comes under the section of scaffolds. So scaffolds don't have to be tangible resources. They can be thinking processes, heuristics. But I saw a great lesson today where the teacher was running through it. It was like, so remember, when we're faced with a problem like this, first we do this, then we do that. And they all knew, like, do this, check this, then do that. And it's like, da, da, da. And then the kind of, whatever you call it, the recipe, the standard approach was being modeled, was a scaffold. And of course, and I think that's a very powerful part of lots of subjects where we have to make the implicit explicit. And sometimes teachers don't realize how explicit they have to make things for it to translate to students.
So I think we got through all 10 principles.
Yeah, good stuff.
Rosenshine's principles, they apply to any subject area, right? Teaching any subject area.
There are a few caveats when you explore his, writings. So in certain places, he's written that it works more for where there's a kind of well-established body of connected knowledge. So you therefore have a knowledge, declarative procedural knowledge thing, which has to break down. So it's much less applicable to, well, in the sense of his direct contact with it, things like creative subjects where you kind of trying to model a creative process rather than any specific checkable on outcomes as such. But I still would say, and I always challenge people, if I just use the 4 strands, is there a subject where you don't sequence things in steps and model how to do things? Is there a subject where you don't question and check for understanding? Is there a subject where you don't review prior learning and move on from there? Is there a subject where you don't guide the practice and then move to independent practice? And I'd say no. Like that's almost absolutely universal. The nature of it is highly variable. And there's an important thing to really be clear about. And even in some of Rosenshine's own writings, for example, he talks about processing information from knowledge within the knowledge structures. And so he gives up, for example, he talks about extensive reading, explaining material to somebody else, writing questions and answering questions, developing knowledge maps, writing daily summaries, applying their ideas to new situations, giving a new example of something, comparing and contrasting different examples, and so on. It's like studying for a test. There's so many different ways of exploring your schema. So in lots of his writings, he's explicitly giving various different ways that you might do this. It's never 5 questions a day at the start of the lesson. So those sorts of routines that people are formulating and saying, oh, we follow Rosenshine, we always start a lesson with a quiz. I just think, well, he doesn't say that. He says, review the learning. But the way you review the learning can be varied, and in fact, should be varied. And it's kind of a misreading to be very linear about that in the name of Rosenshine's principles, because he's quite good at sort of stressing variety of approaches.
We started by talking about practice and 80%, trying to get all students to the point where they're getting 80% correct. A lot of people listening are going to think that's not possible. And if you have wide gaps in the classroom, it's not possible. So what do you think? Is it possible?
I think it is. But it's not about where you start from. It's the old joke, that classic joke of like stopping someone in the street asking for directions and saying, how do I get to the museum? And they say, well, I wouldn't start from here. Like, you're in the wrong place. And obviously that's how that can feel. So for example, if you have a class which is a wide range of attainment already, and then you're asked to teach them to mastery, well, that's going to seem like impossible, isn't it? Because you think, well, they're all at different places. And that's the truth of it. So the only way to get 80% success rate there for everyone is to have a very stratified curriculum diet, for like practice tasks, and teach topics so that everyone's got a similar kind of like place on where we are. But within that, the question levels might be quite varied, and you have to tailor or provide extensive scaffolds for the students to be successful in the same English scenario. For teaching English, like you might have some students writing like blank page, get going, and others with kind of like structured guidance to like first paragraph, second paragraph, word lists, and all sorts of support to reach the same sort of place. And in maths, you might be having all sorts of partially completed examples and that kind of thing. So there are lots of different approaches, but I do think it's harder in some contexts than others. But I'd also say, what's the alternative? The alternative is to say, well, tough. Some of you are going to get less than 80% success rate, and that's just the deal. I'm doing my best, but what else can I do? And I think that's basically saying, I'm not expecting you to do very well in my course because your background knowledge isn't good enough. And that's brutal, isn't it? So I feel that the fundamental responsibility when you're allocated your students in a real teaching scenario is to say, well, these are the guys I've got. How can I take them from where they are? You don't have a choice. And that's why I think in a lot of subjects, anticipating that in the planning is essential. You have to plan a sort of like extract this curriculum hierarchy of progression routes through the curriculum so that we're all in the same sort of territory, but levels of sophistication and depth are variable because they have to be, but not because of design, but because of necessity. Otherwise, some students won't practice. And having like go-to resources for going backwards as well as forwards. I went to a lesson on a school visit with my daughter recently. She's not a teacher, but she came with me. We were watching a teacher explaining negative numbers. And she came out of the lesson. And the first thing she said to me was, "Oh boy, he just needed a number line." And it's like, it was totally in her ears that this class did not have a number line. And it was like, to her as a non-math teacher, it was so obvious that how can you explain this without showing where the numbers are in relation to each other? And that type of thing, like that, no, I know I'm always going to need that. Like it's going to be there, present. You see some math classes where it's just there above the board all the time because we're constantly referring to it. And in other words, in a lesson where other students have got that and they can get all the practice, you've got that to go to and keep visually reminding people and always having this sense of right back to the core kind of conceptual framework, the building blocks of this concept. It's never a bad idea to go right back down and reconnect with the fundamentals. And so that benefits everyone, but it definitely benefits the students who need it, absolutely need it. And that type of approach, I think some teachers could do more on, like, keep it concrete, keep it visual, keep it graphic, keep it connected to stuff people will know. Otherwise, it's so abstract, you're just going to lose the lower third of your class constantly and that type of thing. So having that in mind, these confident students all the time, what's this going to feel like for them, whilst pushing everyone ahead? I mean, it's easier to say this stuff, isn't it? I'm not saying it's easy, but it is the goal. So as long as you're striving towards it all the time and knowing it's happening, that's the other thing. How do you know what the success rate is unless you're really checking constantly? So you have to have this constant feedback loop to yourself of success rate and then doing your best to increase it. That's what you can do. You have to just keep trying.
I think that's a great place to end it. Great answer. And it was an honor and a pleasure to talk to you today. It was a great conversation and awesome to talk about Rosenshine's principles. So thank you. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider showing your support by leaving a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube so you never miss an episode. You can stay connected with me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, X, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn. All links are in the show notes, and check out my website, anastocki.com, for more information. This podcast is funded by a grant from La Trobe University and from the Trottier Family Foundation through a grant to the University of Winnipeg to fund the Chalk and Talk podcast.